Snow fell in heavy flakes, dimming the morning to a gray hush. The wagon creaked down Hollow Bend's main street, a woman sat bound, black shawl pulled close, boots salt white, hair slipped from its braid. She tasted iron and knew it was fear. The scaffold stood beside the courthouse like a corral. Fresh pine bled resin, the rope remembered its coil and swung once, then twice. The sheriff read from a paper so all could hear, theft from a storehouse, lying to the court, shaming a dead husband's name. Children leaned forward. Men spat. Women whispered. She steadied herself by the plain band under her glove, last cool circle of a life burned to ash. Aaron had died of fever 2 winters back, with him went pastures, credit, and the nod at the mercantile door. Debt remained, a pantry like a hollow drum, and a brother by marriage who kept accounts the way a buzzard keeps sky. The word thief clung like burrs. She raised her chin so the rope would not be the tallest thing there. The wagon stopped. A soldier touched the rifle at his shoulder, the driver looked away. A shop door opened and breathed coffee and wood smoke into the snow. She let that scent square her spine. She would not beg the town its entertainment. Clara Hartwell, the sheriff said. Stand. Boards burned cold beneath her soles. The soldier cut the cord at her ankles. The noose swayed within reach. She looked at it as one looks at weather one cannot change. The bell had not rung, and time held still like breath. He folded his paper as if folding justice. People shifted the way a herd does before a river. Snow gathered on her lashes. The world narrowed to spun hemp and a torn knuckle hidden inside her glove. She spoke no prayer. Dignity sometimes lived in silence. Then hooves sounded, soft at first, then certain, the rhythm of one horse making its own law through winter. Then hooves sounded, soft at first, then certain, the rhythm of one horse making its own law through winter. Faces turned as wheat turns for wind. The rider did not hurry. A trail coat hung from his shoulders, hem bearded with snow, the brim of his hat kept his eyes in shade. He guided his horse to the scaffold's foot and spoke without raising his voice. She's with me, he said. The words cut the square like an axe through ice. The soldier's hand froze on the rope. The sheriff's mouth opened and forgot to close. A stir moved like lamp oil as men searched their ledgers for the rider's name. Someone near the livery whispered it. Jonas Crow. North Ridge. Kept to himself. Came to town with hides and a list for nails, coffee, salt. Hard on himself, harder on bad debt. Had buried a wife in a windstorm. His quiet carried weight. Jonas swung down, snow pluming from his coat. He pulled off a glove and drew a worn paper from his pocket. Your warrant won't hold, he said, handing it up. His voice had a riverbed in it, stones and low water. Reverend Pike swore this. She paid for flour and coffee with a brooch and a churn. Her brother-by-law came by night and took the sack from her pantry. Murmur went across the square like winter wind along wire. The storekeeper's wife shrank into wool. The absent accuser grew an outline nobody wished to claim. The sheriff scowled and pretended not to grasp it. The court found otherwise, he said, without marrow. We have law, Jonas answered, looking from noose to woman. Their eyes met. His were creek water under cottonwoods. Law starts with a name spoken straight. I'll vouch her. Breath held. To vouch was coin if coin was needed, roof and food if those were, a man standing between a soul and what the world had sharpened for it. The sheriff knew it. The crowd knew it. The word traveled through her like heat through iron. You vouch, the sheriff said. You take what comes. I do. The rope sagged like a tired snake. The soldier shifted, empty-handed. The sheriff scratched under his kerchief and spat into the snow. Cut her loose, he said at last. Be out of town by sundown. If she steals again, she hangs, and your name hangs with her. Jonas stepped close enough for her to smell cedar smoke and cold iron. His hands were big and work-scarred. He lifted the noose away without touching skin and passed it to the soldier, who took it like a boy returning a borrowed thing. The cords at her wrists were cut. Needles of blood woke in her fingers. Her saved speech deserted her. "Why?" she asked, small under the gallows frame. "Because no one should die in a town square," he said. "And because somebody ought to say your name right." "Clara Hartwell," she said, as if answering roll. Her voice held. He turned to the sheriff. "We're leaving." The crowd opened. Shame moved in some faces like a fever breaking, others watched with the thin hunger of people owed a spectacle. Snow fell like sifted flour. The bell finally struck the hour, late by the minute that mattered. Jonas led the mare to the steps and offered a hand. She placed her palm in his. A prickle ran where rope had flayed skin. He lifted her down as a man lifts something valuable. Her boots touched street. She wavered, and he steadied her with a pressure that promised only balance. They crossed the square. The blacksmith paused with a hammer lifted, old tools hanging behind him like scripture. In the pawnshop window a wedding dress yellowed by years slumped on a mannequin. A broken comb with 3 teeth lay beside a jar of buttons. The street spoke in symbols, and she read them like a code that might be solved. At his horse, Jonas swung up and reached an arm. "Up," he said. She gathered her skirts and mounted behind, shawl scraping his coat. She sat straight, one hand on the cantle. The town fell behind them a step at a time. No one followed. The rope stirred once and was still. Snow braided across the ruts as if the morning meant to stitch the street closed. She looked back once and saw the platform shrink. She did not know the cost his promise would ask. She knew only that she no longer hung over emptiness. For now, that knowledge was fire enough to carry her north toward a ridge she had never seen and a mercy neither of them understood. The snow eased to a fine drift as they rode out of Hollow Bend, the town shrinking behind them into a blur of wood and smoke. Clara Hartwell sat stiff in the saddle behind Jonas Crow, one hand gripping the cantle, the other holding her shawl close at the throat. The mare's breath came in soft white clouds. Leather creaked, the only sound between them besides the muted thud of hooves in snow. Jonas had not spoken since they left the square. He hadn't looked back either. She studied the back of him, the broad line of his shoulders under a trail coat gone dark at the seams, the old felt hat dusted with snow. A pale scar cut from his left ear down to the edge of his jaw, disappearing under his collar. She wondered what blade or bullet had written it. Her own name felt strange in her mind, as if it belonged to a different woman entirely. Clara Hartwell, once wife to Aaron Hartwell, whose cattle grazed the richest grass in 3 counties. Once mistress of a ranch where the pantry shelves groaned in autumn, where guests came for supper and stayed until lamplight. That life had ended with Aaron's fever, his hand burning in hers before it went still. The land passed to his brother, Seth, a man whose kindness lasted only as long as he could profit from it. She'd lasted 2 winters under Seth's roof. The first, she lived in the small room off the kitchen, working from dawn till the stars came up, the family eating first while she scraped the pots. The second winter, he sent her to the line shack with nothing but a blanket and the promise she'd be looked after. When the flour bin emptied and the coffee jar showed only grit, she walked to town and traded her brooch, a gift from Aaron, for a small sack of each. That night, Seth came. In the morning, the flour and coffee were gone, and the law was waiting. Jonas guided the horse up a narrow rise where the wind stripped snow from the rocks. He glanced at the tree-line as though expecting movement. "We'll cut west," he said finally, voice rough as gravel. "Less wind." She didn't answer, unsure if he wanted one. The cold bit into her fingers even through wool. She pulled her shawl tighter, smelling the faint bitterness of prison hay still tangled in her hair. By midday they stopped at a creek gone hard under ice. Jonas dismounted, tied the reins to a sapling, and broke the crust of snow to scoop water for the horse. He offered her the canteen without looking up. She drank carefully, the metal biting at her lips. "Why?" she asked, the word barely more than a breath. Jonas didn't ask what she meant. He set the canteen back in his saddlebag. "Because someone should have stood for you. And I could." She waited for more, but he swung back into the saddle. The conversation, if it could be called that, was over. They rode until the sky bruised toward evening. The land stretched wide, pale grass bending under frost, black cottonwoods clawing at the clouds. The air smelled of pine smoke far off, maybe a homestead or a trapper's camp. Jonas kept scanning the horizon, his hand resting near the rifle strapped to the saddle. "You've enemies," she said quietly. "We all do," he answered. "Some just ride closer than others." She thought of Seth's face when the sheriff led her away. Not anger, satisfaction. He'd gotten rid of her and kept his reputation clean. She wondered if word would reach him that she still drew breath. As the last light bled from the sky, Jonas turned off the main trail toward a stand of pines. A small lean-to crouched at the edge, half buried in snow. Inside, the air was stale with old smoke, but it broke the wind. Jonas set about building a fire with the efficiency of habit, striking flint until the kindling caught. Clara knelt near the flames, warming her hands. The orange light painted the rough lines of her face, sharper now than in the days of full larders and Sunday dresses. She felt his eyes on her, not in judgment but in the way a man looks at something he's trying to understand. "You've been alone a while," he said. She met his gaze. "And you?" He tossed a log onto the fire. Sparks jumped like fireflies against the dark. "Long enough." They ate jerky and hard bread, washed down with water gone tepid from the fire's heat. Outside, wind moved in the branches like low surf. Clara lay on the lean-to's floor, staring at the seam where roof met wall. Jonas sat with his back to the fire, hat pulled low, the rifle across his knees. She closed her eyes, but sleep came slow. His voice, earlier, when he'd claimed her in the square, steady, unhurried, kept circling in her mind. It wasn't the voice of a man rescuing a stranger for charity. It was the voice of someone making a promise, even if he didn't know yet what it would cost him. In the deep hours, she woke to find him still there, watching the tree lean. The fire was low, the embers breathing red. Snow whispered against the roof. For a moment, in the half-light, she thought of Aaron, how he used to keep watch over the herd in calving season, eyes scanning the dark for coyotes. She turned back to the wall, the rough boards pressing into her shoulder. Survival, she realized, might now mean trusting Jonas Crow. And trust was a currency she had spent down to nothing. But in the cold of that night, with the wind held at bay and a stranger between her and whatever moved in the shadows, she felt the smallest shift, like the first hairline crack in a frozen creek, quiet but certain, promising change. The third day rose mean and white. Wind came off the high country with a blade's edge. Snow cut through wool and found skin as if it remembered warmth. The mare labored, legs swallowed by drifts that hid sage and stone. Jonas Crow kept the reins steady, hat brim pinned low, the scar at his jaw gone colorless. Clara rode behind him, shawl knotted hard at her throat, every breath a cloud that broke and vanished before it could comfort. By noon the sky turned to pewter. Trees leaned east as if the storm had pushed all night and meant to keep going. Jonas angled the horse off the trail toward boulders, then down through spruce into a crease of land where the wind lost its teeth. There, half buried to the windows, crouched a cabin with a roof pitched against weight. The door was rimed with ice, the latch welded shut by sleet. Jonas swung down, shouldered the drift aside with a plank freed from the snow, and struck the latch until the crust cracked like glass. Hinges cried and gave. Air rolled out that smelled of cedar smoke long gone and coffee forgotten in a tin. He led the mare under the eave, cut a pocket in the drift so she could stand out of the gale, brought in the saddle and blanket roll, and shut the door against the storm's pale breath. Inside, flint sparked until dry moss took, until cedar chips flamed, until the first log spoke in soft pops. The single room wore careful order. A rifle rested on pegs above the hearth, oiled so the stock shone and the barrel held a blue sheen. A rocking chair waited by the fire, its runners polished by years of evening thought. From a rafter hung a braid of onions whose papery skins whispered whenever the roof shrugged off wind. Clara stood very still and let the heat reach her bones. Melt beaded along the fringe of her shawl and darkened the wool. She touched the tear begun in the jailhouse plank and thought of the woman who had taught her that stitch. On a peg hung a man's hat and a woman's apron, both clean, both refusing the word abandoned. A coffee mill sat on the shelf beside a tin of salt and 3 cups lined like sentries along a board. Jonas stacked wood and checked the shutters, pressing snow into their seams to hold back the worst of the wind. When water simmered he stirred grounds into a dented pot and let the smell rise. The coffee was bitter and thin, but it was warm and honest. They drank from cups chipped at the rim, hands wrapped around heat like beggars at a small fire, steam painting their breath while the storm pressed its face to the chinks and found no welcome. By late afternoon the wind had found its true voice and kept it. It combed the roof for weakness, pressed its mouth to the logs, searched for entry and failed. Jonas split kindling by the door, the axe thudding into a block scarred by winters. Each stroke measured time. Clara took needle and thread from her skirt pocket and began to mend the shawl. She pushed the needle through the wool, drew it clean, and laid the knot flat so it would not catch. Small work steadied her hands. Jonas noticed. Wolves called in the white distance, a clean high note that lifted the hair along her forearms. The mare answered with a troubled blow. Jonas looked to the door and then to the rifle, and did not lift it. He listened until the sound faded to suggestion, then returned to the wood. His calm felt like an oath to act only when action would matter, a quiet promise to the storm and to the woman sewing her life one stitch at a time. The room's order revealed itself in layers. A basket of old tools stood by the bench, handles worn dark by faithful hands. A folded square of wedding lace, browned by years, lay in a tin beside a comb with 3 teeth and a narrow blue ribbon. Clara's gaze returned to those things as a moth returns to a flame. She wondered whose hair the ribbon had bound, whose dress had once carried that lace down a church aisle to where vows stand like fences against weather and time. When the kettle hushed and the fire settled to a deep heart, they spoke, not of law or names but of small tethering things. He asked if the shawl was family. She said yes, that her mother had taught her the stitch and her grandmother had insisted on tight edges against prairie wind. He said the chair came from a man who could whittle a cradle or a yoke with the same care. They traded such coins without debt attached, proofs that life had not always been a ledger of loss. Night took the windows and made them mirrors. Jonas stepped out to check the drift and the animal, came back with frost along his beard, barred the door, and ran a hand down the rifle like a man greeting a faithful friend. He laid the axe within reach, pressed each shutter again with his shoulder, and sat near the hearth where he could see both door and pallet. Clara stitched and listened to thread pull and settle, a soft human sound that argued with the gale and would not yield. She lay at last under a quilt that smelled of cedar, the mended shawl across her like a vow. The roof sang with snow driven like sand. From far off came the wolves again, and from nearer, the steady breath of a horse that trusted the wall. She realized then that the stranger had not asked for her story. He had not demanded wrongs or names to blame. His silence held no accusation. It made a room for her sorrow without asking it to speak. Across the firelight Jonas sat with his back to the log wall, eyes half closed and open enough. The pale line of his scar refused both heat and explanation. He seemed cut from the same timber as the beams, yet nothing in him felt dead. She watched him listen to the storm, to the mare, to the absence of footsteps outside. He had placed himself between her and the night as simply as he had said the words in the square, and he kept that place without ceremony. She let her eyes fall shut. For the first time in many months, sleep came without a fight. Shelter had become more than boards and roof. It had become the careful keeping of fire, a rifle set within reach and left untouched, a rocking chair waiting for weight, a braid of onions testifying that a hand had prepared for hunger and believed someone would step out of weather needing mercy. In that small room, lit by steady orange, the pull of safety began inside her like a slow, sure tide. The storm did not lift, it merely changed its voice from a howl to a deep, constant moan, as if the wind had grown tired of shouting but meant to keep pressing at the cabin's walls until they yielded. Days stacked one atop the other like split logs, measured in the same small labors. In the pale light of each morning, Jonas chopped wood in the drifted clearing beside the shed, steam rising from his coat and beard. Each swing of the axe was slow and certain, the sound carrying through the still air between gusts. Clara could hear it from the hearth where she worked, the rhythm as steady as a clock. Inside, she cooked what little they had, beans boiled down with a pinch of salt, stale bread softened in coffee until it gave under the spoon. They ate in companionable silence, the scrape of tin spoons in bowls and the faint hiss of the fire filling the space where words might have been. When they crossed paths, he setting an armload of wood by the hearth, she passing with a pot to the table, their eyes met briefly, and in that glance was an unspoken inventory: you are here. You are whole. By the fourth day, the snow lay nearly to the windowsills. The mare's stall under the eave was a cave of packed white. Jonas kept her fed from a small store of hay, brushing her coat until it shone despite the cold. Clara mended a shirt for him, patching the sleeve with careful, even stitches. He accepted it with a nod and a faint tightening at the corner of his mouth, a look that seemed to mean more than a thank you. That evening, as the light thinned to blue, a knock rattled the door. It was not the tentative tap of someone uncertain, but the urgent, uneven thump of cold stiffened hands. Jonas's head came up at once. He set aside the knife he had been using to whittle kindling and crossed the room in 3 strides, the rifle coming off its pegs as naturally as a coat. When he opened the door, the wind shoved a man inside. Snow crusted his beard and clung to his eyebrows, his coat was soaked dark to the elbows. Clara stepped back instinctively, the smell of whiskey reaching her before his words did. "Well, hell," the man said, teeth flashing under frost. "Jonas Crow. I figured you'd be holed up somewhere warm." His gaze moved past Jonas to Clara, and lingered there long enough for her to feel it as plainly as a hand. "Didn't know you'd have company." Jonas shut the door against the wind, barring it with a solid push. "Eli Warren," he said flatly. "You look half dead." "Half's more than I had yesterday," Eli answered with a grin that didn't warm his eyes. He sloughed off his gloves and held his hands toward the fire. "Came from the drive, if you can call it that now. Cattle scattered, men gone. Figured I'd find the nearest roof and see if the welcome was any better than the weather." Jonas didn't move from between Eli and Clara. "You'll dry out. Eat. Leave in the morning." Eli's grin widened, though it held something sour. Always the hospitable one. His eyes slid back to Clara. "And you are?" "Clara Hartwell," she said before Jonas could speak for her. Her tone was even, but her chin lifted a fraction. "Pleasure," Eli drawled, though the word carried less courtesy than claim. Didn't think Jonas here kept the kind of company that could sew a decent patch or keep a fire lit. Jonas's hands were loose on the rifle, but the barrel was angled just enough to be a language Eli understood. The air in the cabin thickened, the storm outside fading to a background whisper. Eli chuckled low. "All right. No offense meant." He eased himself onto the bench by the wall, peeling off his wet coat. "I'll take that dry corner and keep my mouth shut. For now." Clara ladled beans into a tin plate, set it on the table with bread beside it. "Eat while it's hot," she said, her voice clipped, and returned to her place near the hearth. Jonas didn't sit. He stood until Eli finished his meal, eyes steady, as though measuring the weight of every swallow. When the plate was clean, Jonas spoke. "First light," he said. "You ride." Eli smirked but didn't argue. He stretched out on the bench, boots still on, and turned his back to the room. Within minutes, his breathing had settled into the uneven rhythm of a man who sleeps hard from whiskey and cold. Clara met Jonas's eyes across the fire. In them she read no apology for the rifle still in his hands, no embarrassment at his silence. Only watchfulness, the kind that chooses its place and holds it. It struck her then that what he'd done in the town square was not for show, not a single act to be forgotten once the danger passed. His protection was a habit he lived by, and it cost him comfort, safety, maybe even friendships. She looked toward Eli's sleeping form and felt no fear. Not because danger was gone. By the fifth morning, the wind had gone quiet. The snow lay in soft, blinding mounds, the sky a hard, unbroken blue. Jonas stepped outside and stood for a long moment, letting the silence settle. When he came back in, he pulled on his coat and nodded toward the door. "Come on," he said. "We've got work to do." The air bit at Clara's cheeks as she followed him across the drifted yard to the shed. He shouldered the door open, and the scent of dry pine and cold iron rose up from the shadows. Dust drifted in the light slicing through a crack in the roof. The place was neatly kept, tools hung in their places, harnesses looped over pegs, a barrel of oats in one corner. Jonas began moving crates, stacking them so she could sweep out the frost that had crept under the door. As she worked, her eye caught a small wooden chest tucked behind a pile of kindling. The latch was simple brass, worn smooth. She lifted the lid before she thought better of it. Inside lay a pair of lace gloves, yellowed and fragile as dry leaves. Beneath them, a faded wedding dress, its ivory dulled to cream, folded with a care that spoke of long keeping. At the bottom was a comb with 3 broken teeth, a strand of hair still caught in it, pale as corn silk. Jonas's shadow fell over her. She looked up and found him standing very still, his eyes on the chest. He reached down and lifted the dress with both hands. His fingers were careful, but there was a tightness in his grip, as if the fabric might crumble if he held it too loosely. The firelight from the crack in the wall caught on his face, showing lines that had nothing to do with age. "It was hers," he said, his voice low, like the first words after a burial. Clara didn't need to ask whose. "Fire took her," Jonas went on, folding the dress back into the chest. "And the house. I kept what I could find. These are what the flames left." He closed the lid gently, his palm resting there a moment before he moved the box back to its place. They didn't speak again until the work was done. That evening, the cabin felt warmer than it had all week. Jonas sat at the table, oiling the rifle, while Clara took one of his shirts onto her lap and threaded a needle. The tier was small, but she worked it with slow precision, the rocking chair creaking softly beneath her. Jonas watched her over the rifle's barrel, his hands moving with the same steady care she gave her stitches. In the shifting firelight, her hair caught a copper edge, and the lines of her face softened. For a moment, the room seemed to hold more than just 2 people, it felt occupied by something unspoken, an almost home that neither dared name. She tied off the thread, smoothed the fabric, and handed the shirt to him. He set it aside without trying it on. "Thank you," he said, and the words held more weight than their size. Clara leaned back, the shawl draped around her shoulders. "It's a fine thing, mending. Gives you time to think." He glanced at her, then back to the fire. "About what?" "About what's gone," she said quietly. "And what's still worth keeping." He nodded once, the motion deliberate. "You wake some mornings expecting to hear a voice that's been gone for years. And for a second, you believe you will. Then the room's too quiet, and you remember." Clara's eyes softened. "I know." For a time, only the fire spoke. Its light moved over the walls, catching on the braid of onions, the worn pegs, the rifle's gleam. The storm had left behind a peace that felt fragile, as if one wrong word could send it scattering like snow in a hard wind. Jonas set the rifle aside, leaned forward, and rested his forearms on his knees. "In town," he said, "when I said you were with me, I didn't have a reason that made sense. Not then. But no one should die without someone saying their name. Clara held his gaze. And you said mine. I did. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, of shared losses, of the weight of things neither could give back, of the strange fact that they were both still here when so much else was gone. She reached for her sewing again, though the shirt was already mended. The needle dipped and rose, dipping and rising, the thread looping like the small ties that hold a life together when the rest has come undone. Jonas watched her hands move, and for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel haunted by absence. It felt like a place where something might yet be kept safe. The thaw came slow, but it came. Snow sank into itself, turning heavy and wet, the drifts caving at the edges. The trail from the cabin to the low road showed in dark, narrow veins where Jonas's boots and the mare's hooves had passed over the weeks. It was a trapper from the ridge who brought the word. He came riding hard at noon, his coat crusted with slush, his voice low with urgency. Seth Hartwell's riding north, he said, glancing at Clara as though she might already know. 2 men with him. Says Jonas Crow's keeping a thief, and he means to see justice done himself. Jonas didn't waste time on questions. He set his coffee aside, pulled his coat from the peg, and went out to the shed. The saddle went on in silence, cinch pulled tight, bridle buckled with the same care he'd give before a long cattle drive. Clara watched from the doorway, the shawl pulled close against the damp air. "You're not letting him come to you," she said. Jonas didn't look up. "Not when the ground's mine to choose." The ride south was quiet. Mud bled up through the snow in long strips, the mare's hooves pulling free with soft, wet sounds. The land smelled of thaw, rich earth waking under the melt. Jonas kept his eyes on the horizon, where the road bent toward Hollow Bend. They saw the town before the town saw them. Smoke rose from chimneys, the blacksmith's hammer rang faint and steady. The scaffold still stood in the square, rope swaying lazily in the damp wind. Clara's stomach tightened. She had left this place under a noose, and now she was riding back into it. At the edge of the main street, Seth Hartwell sat his horse with 2 men flanking him. His coat was clean, his hat pushed back to show a face arranged for the crowd gathering on the boardwalks. "Well," Seth said, smiling without warmth. "If it isn't the man who thinks he can set the law aside when it pleases him." Jonas swung down from the saddle, his boots landing in the wet grit of the street. "Law's not your word to twist," he said evenly. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small, weathered ledger bound in cracked leather. Seth's smile faltered. Jonas opened the book to a page marked with a strip of cloth. "Storekeeper's hand," he said, holding it up so the nearest of the crowd could see. 1 sack of flour. 1 sack of coffee. Paid for with a gold brooch and a butter churn. Taken to Clara Hartwell's pantry. Dates there. So's the mark showing they were removed by S. Hartwell, and not with her say-so. A murmur moved through the street. The storekeeper's wife, standing near the door of the mercantile, lowered her eyes. Seth's jaw tightened. "You don't know what she's done." "I know enough," Jonas said, closing the ledger. "And now they do too." He let the book fall into Seth's hand. The gesture was quiet, but it rang louder than any shout. The 2 men beside Seth shifted in their saddles, their eyes on the crowd instead of him. Jonas stepped back, his voice steady. "You take this any further, you're not chasing justice. You're chasing spite. And everyone here knows it." Silence spread, slow but certain. The same street that had once pressed in to see Clara hang now stood still, the faces turned toward Seth no longer certain of the ending they had been promised. Jonas turned then, looking to Clara. The air between them held no weight of debt, no demand. Only choice. "You can ride with me," he said quietly. "Or take your own road." Clara looked past him at Seth, who would not meet her eyes, then back to Jonas. Her voice was steady. "I'll ride." Jonas gave a single nod, swung back into the saddle, and offered his hand. She took it, the contact brief but grounding, and climbed up behind him. They left the town without hurry, the mare's hooves striking the wet earth in an easy rhythm. No one followed. The scaffold faded behind them, the rope still swaying in the wind like it was waiting for a name that would never be spoken there again. By the time they reached the ridge, the sun was lowering, the snowmelt running in narrow streams along the trail. The air smelled of cedar and new earth. Clara looked ahead at the long stretch of land unfolding toward the horizon. She didn't know what lay there, whether it would be shelter or more storms, but for the first time in many months, she felt the road beneath her belonged to her own choosing. Jonas didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence at her back was enough, steady as the horse beneath them, carrying them toward whatever came next, not as savior and saved, but as two people who had chosen, in the face of all that had been taken from them, to ride forward together.